Have you ever wondered how a small trading company from Britain came to rule a land of over 300 million people? How did the East India Company, once just buying spices and textiles, grow into an empire that controlled vast territories, reshaped economies, and influenced the lives of millions? What was it like for the people who lived under this empire, caught between opportunity, exploitation, and rebellion? In this video, we're diving deep into the rise, rule, and ultimate decline of the British Empire in the East. From brutal conquests and cunning diplomacy to revolts that shook the empire to its core and the eventual fight for independence, we'll uncover the stories, strategies, and legacies that still shape Asia today. So stay with us, because the story of the British Empire in the East is not just history. It's a story of power, resilience, and transformation that will make you question everything you thought you knew about empire. The dawn of British interests in the East, circa 1600-1750. The story of the British Empire in the East begins not with grand armies or sprawling colonies, but with ships, trade ambitions, and a small chartered company. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the newly formed East India Company, a modest enterprise with a seemingly simple mission: to trade spices, silk, and other valuable commodities between England and the vast lands of the East. What began as a commercial endeavor would eventually evolve into a dominion stretching across the Indian subcontinent, shaping the politics, culture, and economics of Asia for centuries. The East India Company was initially a tiny player in a world dominated by Portuguese, Dutch, and later French merchants. Its first voyages were fraught with danger. Storms, piracy, and competition with rival European powers threatened the survival of the venture. Yet, the company's shrewd combination of diplomacy and force gradually allowed it to establish footholds along the Indian coastline. Ports like Surat, Madras, now Chennai, and Bombay, now Mumbai, became vital centers for trade. These coastal settlements, initially trading posts, would later serve as springboards for territorial control. Unlike the aggressive colonial models of later centuries, the early British strategy in India relied heavily on alliances with local rulers. The company understood that outright conquest was neither feasible nor desirable at first. Instead, they navigated a complex landscape of regional kingdoms, sultans, and empires, offering military aid or financial incentives in exchange for trading privileges. This pragmatic approach allowed the British to gradually embed themselves within the existing political framework of the region. By the early 17th century, the Mughal Empire, then the dominant power in India, controlled vast swathes of the subcontinent. The Mughals, under emperors like Jahangir and Shah Jahan, were more concerned with internal consolidation and their own imperial ambitions than with European traders. This provided the British with a window of opportunity. By paying tribute and respecting Mughal authority, the company secured the rights to trade in key cities. Surat, the Mughal Empire's principal port, became the first major hub for British commerce in India. Trade, however, was far from simple. The East India Company faced constant threats, from piracy in the Arabian Sea to rival European companies seeking to dominate the same markets. The Dutch East India Company, in particular, posed a formidable challenge. They controlled the lucrative spice trade in Southeast Asia and viewed British expansion with suspicion. Yet, through persistence and careful negotiation, the British gradually carved out their own network of trade routes. The British approach was not limited to commerce alone. From the very beginning, they understood the necessity of military power to protect their interests. Fortifications sprang up around trading posts, and company ships were armed to defend against both European rivals and local resistance. These fortified enclaves were the precursors to the more extensive military infrastructure that would define British imperial control in later centuries. By the mid-17th century, the East India Company had grown into a formidable commercial enterprise, with annual trade volumes increasing dramatically. Textiles from India, particularly cotton and silk, were in high demand in Europe. Spices, once the crown jewel of Asian trade, continued to fetch enormous profits. In addition, the company began to diversify its operations, importing precious stones, indigo dye, and other luxury goods. This growing wealth allowed the company to wield influence far beyond the marketplace. The political landscape of the Indian subcontinent during this period was complex. The Mughal Empire, while dominant, was not monolithic. Regional governors or subahtars wielded significant autonomy, and smaller kingdoms often resisted imperial authority. The British exploited these divisions skillfully. By forming selective alliances and offering military support, they positioned themselves as indispensable partners to local rulers. This method of embedding influence through diplomacy and strategic alliances would become a hallmark of British expansion. The East India Company also began to develop administrative structures to manage its growing operations. Company officials were granted extensive powers, including the ability to levy taxes, maintain private armies, and administer justice within company-controlled territories. This quasi-sovereign authority was unprecedented for a commercial enterprise, and it laid the groundwork for the transformation of the company from a trading entity into a governing power. In the broader East, the British were not confined to India alone. By the mid-17th century, the company had established trading posts in Southeast Asia, including Malacca and Bencoolen. These outposts, though smaller than the Indian establishments, played a crucial role in linking British trade to the broader Asian market. The British learned to navigate diverse cultural and political environments, from the Malay sultanates to the kingdoms of Burma, forging relationships that balanced diplomacy with the implicit threat of force. The company's success was also driven by its ability to adapt European commercial practices to Asian contexts. Unlike the Dutch, who often relied on monopoly and coercion, the British demonstrated flexibility. They engaged with local merchants, adopted indigenous accounting methods, and even learned local languages. This adaptability allowed them to integrate into regional economies rather than disrupt them entirely, creating a mutually beneficial, if unequal, system of trade. By the late 17th century, British influence in the East had become both commercial and political. Conflicts with the French and Dutch in India and Southeast Asia were frequent, as each power sought to expand its trading privileges and territorial footholds. The Carnatic Wars, fought in southern India between British and French-backed forces, exemplified the intertwining of European rivalries and local power struggles. The outcomes of these conflicts often determined which European power would dominate trade in particular regions for decades. The British also began experimenting with methods of revenue extraction in India. Initially limited to customs duties and trade tariffs, these financial measures evolved into more formalized taxation systems in areas where the company held de facto control. This was a subtle but significant shift, transforming the company from a mere trader to a quasi-governmental entity with real influence over land, labor, and local economies. Religious and cultural interactions added another layer of complexity. Missionary activity, while not initially a primary goal, gradually accompanied British expansion. Protestant missionaries sought to convert local populations, introduce Western education, and spread European cultural practices. These efforts were met with varying degrees of resistance and acceptance, and they foreshadowed the more systematic cultural interventions that would characterize later British rule. By 1750, the stage was set for a dramatic transformation. The East India Company had evolved from a small trading enterprise into a power capable of shaping the political landscape of an entire continent. Fortified settlements, private armies, and sophisticated administrative structures gave the British the tools to move beyond trade into territorial conquest. The foundations of empire were firmly established, though the full scale of British dominance in the East would only emerge in the decades to come. In summary, the first 150 years of British engagement in the East were marked by cautious expansion, strategic alliances, and adaptive commerce. The East India Company's success was not the result of sudden conquest, but of meticulous planning, negotiation, and integration into existing political systems. By leveraging trade, diplomacy, and military power, the British had laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most expansive empires in history. From trade to territory, The rise of British power, 1750 to 1800. By the mid-18th century, the East India Company had moved far beyond its initial role as a commercial enterprise. What had started as a network of trading posts and diplomatic agreements had evolved into a complex power structure capable of shaping the destinies of entire regions. The period between 1750 and 1800 was critical. It marked the transition of British influence in India from commerce to outright political and territorial dominance. This transformation was driven by a combination of internal conflicts in India, rivalries among European powers, and the company's growing ambition to secure permanent control over key regions. The Mughal Empire, once the unchallenged authority in India, was entering a period of decline. Emperors like Aurangzeb had left behind a fragmented legacy. After his death in 1707, the central authority weakened, and regional governors or nawabs and local chieftains began to assert greater autonomy. This fragmentation created both opportunities and challenges for the British. Unlike a unified empire that could resist foreign encroachment, a politically divided subcontinent offered numerous entry points for a shrewd and well-resourced European power. The turning point came during the Carnatic Wars in southern India. These conflicts, spanning from 1746 to 1763, were initially extensions of European rivalries, particularly between Britain and France, but they were fought on Indian soil, with local powers drawn into the fray. The British, under commanders like Robert Clive, learned to leverage military victories to secure political concessions. The outcome of these wars firmly established British supremacy over French rivals in India, allowing the company to consolidate its positions in key southern ports like Madras and Fort St. George. Clive's campaigns demonstrated a new approach: the combination of military power, political alliances, and financial manipulation. Following the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Clive and the British East India Company effectively installed Mir Jafar as the Nawab of Bengal, securing a puppet ruler who would advance British interests. This victory was not merely a battlefield success. It marked a decisive shift in the nature of British involvement in India. For the first time, the company gained the ability to control revenue, administer regions, and dictate local policies, functions that previously belonged to sovereign powers. The significance of Bengal cannot be overstated. As one of India's wealthiest provinces, it provided the East India Company with vast resources to fund further expansion. The revenues extracted from Bengal's rich agricultural lands and bustling trade networks financed military campaigns, administrative expansion, and further territorial acquisitions. In many ways, Bengal became the engine of the British Empire in India, demonstrating the intricate link between economic exploitation and political control. By the late 18th century, the British were not just intervening in regional politics, they were reshaping them. The annexation of territories such as Bihar, Odisha, and parts of the Carnatic region highlighted a strategy that went beyond commerce. British influence was no longer limited to coastal trading posts. It extended deep into the interior, often using a combination of diplomacy, coercion, and outright conquest. The principle was clear: control the revenue, control the region. The expansion was accompanied by administrative experimentation. The East India Company began to implement systematic governance structures in the territories under its influence. The Diwani rights, the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha, granted the company unprecedented control over local economies. With these rights, company officials could levy taxes, regulate trade, and even influence local justice systems. This quasi-governmental authority transformed the East India Company into a state-like entity within India, blurring the lines between commercial enterprise and imperial rule. British expansion was not without resistance. Local rulers, nobles, and peasants frequently rebelled against the company's growing authority. The Sannyasi rebellion in Bengal, for example, reflected the broader tensions caused by economic exploitation and cultural interference. Armed uprisings, though often localized, revealed the fragility of British control and the underlying resentment of indigenous populations. The company learned quickly: To maintain dominance, military power needed to be supplemented by political cunning and strategic alliances. Meanwhile, the British were not operating in isolation. They faced ongoing rivalry with the French, who maintained enclaves in Pondicherry and other southern regions. These conflicts, while eventually resulting in British dominance, forced the East India Company to develop sophisticated military strategies and establish a permanent army of both European and Indian soldiers. The creation of the sepoy regiments, composed of Indian soldiers under British command, became a defining feature of the company's military apparatus. This hybrid army allowed the British to project power across vast distances at relatively low cost. The late 18th century also witnessed British ventures beyond India. The company sought to expand influence in Southeast Asia, particularly in regions such as Malaya, Burma, and the Straits of Malacca, recognizing the strategic importance of maritime trade routes. These endeavors, though secondary to the Indian conquests, demonstrated the East India Company's ambition to dominate commerce across the entire eastern seaboard. British ports in India became bases for these regional operations, linking Indian resources to wider global networks of trade and influence. Economic policies were central to British consolidation. The company introduced regulations that favored British merchants, often at the expense of local industries. Bengal's once thriving textile sector, for instance, faced restrictions that redirected profits toward British traders. While these measures secured short-term gains for the company, they sowed long-term social and economic discontent, contributing to the cycle of resistance and repression that would characterize colonial rule in later decades. Culture and religion, though not primary tools of conquest at this stage, began to shape British engagement. Missionary activity remained limited, but the company's interactions with local rulers, religious institutions, and merchant guilds required a nuanced understanding of indigenous customs. British administrators learned to navigate complex social hierarchies, mediating disputes, and manipulating local politics to consolidate their power. This adaptive approach enabled the company to maintain control without provoking wholesale rebellion, a strategy that would prove critical in the expansionist phase of the 19th century. By 1800, the British East India Company had transformed from a commercial enterprise into a dominant political power in India. From the trading posts of Surat and Madras, the company now controlled vast territories, commanded a formidable army, and administered revenue systems that underpinned its authority. The transition from trade to territorial control was complete. The British were no longer outsiders seeking profit. They were rulers, shaping the destinies of millions and laying the foundations for what would become the British Raj. The period from 1750 to 1800 thus represents a pivotal chapter in the British Empire in the East. The combination of military success, political alliances, revenue control, and administrative innovation allowed the British to secure a position of unprecedented influence. The strategies honed during this period, using local divisions to advantage, embedding economic dominance within political structures, and creating a hybrid military, would define British imperialism for the next century. By the turn of the 19th century, the stage was set for the British to extend their control even further, consolidating their empire across India and beyond. Consolidation and control, the British in India, 1800 to 1857. As the 19th century dawned, the British Empire in India had shifted firmly from trade-driven ambitions to territorial dominion. The East India Company, having established strongholds in Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, now faced the task of consolidating power across a subcontinent marked by immense diversity, culturally, linguistically, and politically. This period, stretching from 1800 to 1857, was one of strategic expansion, administrative experimentation, and deepening entanglement in Indian society, setting the stage for one of the most significant uprisings in the empire's history. Following its territorial gains in the 18th century, the East India Company sought to stabilize and formalize its authority. Administrative structures introduced in Bengal and other controlled regions were expanded and refined. District officers, collectors, and magistrates were appointed to manage revenue, law, and order. The permanent settlement of 1793, though initiated slightly earlier, had long-lasting effects during this period, particularly in Bengal. It fixed the land revenue that zamindars or local landlords had to pay to the company, creating a class of intermediaries loyal to British authority. While this system secured predictable revenue for the company, it also entrenched socio-economic inequalities, exacerbating the vulnerability of peasants and sowing the seeds of discontent. Military power remained central to British control. The company's hybrid army of European officers and sepoys, locally recruited soldiers, allowed the British to project authority across vast territories. These forces were not only used for defense, but also to suppress revolts and enforce policies, effectively making the army both a tool of conquest and a mechanism of governance. Strategic forts, cantonments, and garrisons were established across India, ensuring rapid response to threats and reinforcing the perception of British invincibility. Diplomacy continued to play a key role in expansion. Through treaties, alliances, and subsidiary arrangements, the British extended their influence without direct annexation. The doctrine of subsidiary alliances, formulated under Lord Wellesley, exemplified this approach. Indian rulers were compelled to accept British troops stationed in their territories and cede control of foreign affairs to the company, effectively reducing them to puppet states. This system allowed the British to control vast areas without immediate administrative responsibility, while subtly undermining indigenous sovereignty. The early 19th century also witnessed significant military campaigns aimed at expanding territorial control. Wars with regional powers, such as the Mysore Wars against Tipu Sultan and the Maratha Wars, demonstrated the effectiveness of British military organization and strategy. By defeating these formidable opponents, the British not only annexed territories, but also eliminated potential centers of resistance. The fall of Mysore and the dismemberment of the Maratha Confederacy consolidated British supremacy over much of central and southern India, paving the way for the eventual unification of their dominions. Economic exploitation intensified during this period. The company increasingly intervened in agriculture, trade, and production, ensuring that local economies served imperial interests. Cash crops such as indigo, opium, and cotton were promoted, often at the expense of subsistence farming. The opium trade, in particular, became a major source of revenue, with India supplying opium to China under British control, a precursor to the later Opium Wars. While profitable for the company, these policies disrupted traditional livelihoods and deepened the socio-economic disparities within Indian society. Cultural and social interactions during this period were complex. The British, though not yet systematically imposing their culture, began introducing reforms aimed at what they termed modernization. Education, legal reforms, and missionary activities expanded gradually. English language schools, Western-style legal codes, and infrastructural projects like roads, canals, and railways began to transform the Indian landscape. These initiatives were intended to create a class of intermediaries, educated Indians who could assist in governance, while subtly promoting British ideals and values. The period also saw tensions emerging between traditional Indian society and British policies. Social practices, such as sati, child marriage, and caste hierarchies, became focal points for reformist intervention. While some British administrators advocated abolition and reform on humanitarian grounds, others saw such changes as a means to strengthen imperial control. The implementation of these policies often caused friction, leading to resentment among sections of Indian society who viewed them as foreign interference in local customs. Religious and cultural dynamics played a significant role in shaping political outcomes. Missionary activity, although limited, created early friction between local populations and British authority. At the same time, the British adopted a strategy of pragmatic tolerance, often avoiding direct interference in religious practices unless it served administrative or political objectives. This delicate balancing act was essential to maintaining authority over a population deeply attached to its religious and cultural traditions. By the 1840s and 1850s, the British Empire in India had achieved unprecedented territorial expansion. Major annexations, including Sindh and Punjab, demonstrated the company's willingness to use military power alongside diplomacy. Yet, this expansion also stretched administrative capacities and intensified the reliance on the sepoy army, which was increasingly drawn from specific regions and communities, creating divisions within the Indian military itself. Economic grievances, cultural interventions, and military impositions coalesced into widespread dissatisfaction. The annexation of territories often dispossessed local rulers and disrupted traditional systems of governance and patronage. Land revenue policies, coupled with the commercialization of agriculture, placed heavy burdens on peasants and small landholders. The increasing presence of British officials in everyday life fueled perceptions of exploitation and alien governance. These accumulated tensions eventually reached a breaking point in 1857. While not yet a single nationwide revolt, multiple uprisings, beginning in Meerut and spreading across northern and central India, signaled the culmination of decades of accumulated resentment. Soldiers, dispossessed princes, and peasants found common cause against the British, their motivations rooted in political, economic, and cultural grievances. The revolt that erupted in 1857, later termed the Indian Rebellion or the Sepoy Mutiny, was the direct consequence of the patterns of control, expansion, and exploitation that had characterized British rule for more than half a century. The period from 1800 to 1857 thus represents a complex phase in the history of the British Empire in the East. It was a time of consolidation and centralization, of expanding political and military control, and of profound social, economic, and cultural transformations. The East India Company had evolved from a trading enterprise into a dominant political power, capable of governing millions and projecting authority across a vast continent. Yet, this dominance was fragile, dependent on continuous negotiation, coercion, and military presence, and it sowed the seeds of the first major revolt against British rule. By 1857, the British had built an empire that combined commerce, administration, and military might. But the very strategies that ensured their dominance, subjugation of local rulers, economic exploitation, cultural imposition, and reliance on a sepoy army, also generated resistance. The rebellion of 1857 would expose vulnerabilities, forcing the British to rethink governance and paving the way for the transformation from company rule to direct imperial administration under the British Crown. The stage was set for a new chapter in the story of the British Empire in the East, one defined not just by conquest, but by attempts to govern, reform, and sustain authority in the face of persistent resistance. The Rebellion of 1857 and the birth of the British Raj, 1857 to 1870. The year 1857 marked a turning point in the history of British India. After more than 2 centuries of East India Company expansion, administration, and control, simmering tensions between the company and the Indian populace erupted into a widespread revolt. Known in history as the Indian Rebellion of 1857 or the Sepoy Mutiny, this event was the culmination of decades of political, economic, and cultural friction, and it forced the British to rethink their governance of the subcontinent. The immediate spark of the rebellion was military in nature. Indian soldiers, or sepoys, serving under the East India Company, were issued new rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to Hindu and Muslim religious practices. This insensitivity to local customs ignited anger among the sepoys, who saw it as a symbol of the company's disregard for Indian religious and cultural traditions. Yet, the revolt was far more than a reaction to religious insult. It reflected deep-seated resentment against British policies, economic exploitation, and the loss of traditional authority. The rebellion quickly spread beyond the military ranks. Dispossessed princes, peasants burdened by taxation, artisans affected by commercial monopolies, and local landlords who had lost power under the doctrine of lapse joined the uprising. The revolt encompassed vast regions of northern and central India, including Meerut, Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, and Jhansi, transforming what began as a military grievance into a nationwide challenge to British authority. Leadership emerged from both traditional and unexpected quarters. Figures such as Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, Tantia Tope, and Nana Sahib became symbols of resistance, blending military strategy with political symbolism. Their determination and strategic acumen posed serious challenges to the company's forces, revealing the depth of Indian opposition. At the same time, many local rulers remained loyal to the British, often motivated by fear of loss or the desire to maintain their own positions, illustrating the complex dynamics of loyalty and resistance within Indian society. The British response was swift and brutal. Reinforcements were sent from Britain, and the company's European soldiers, along with loyal Indian units, were deployed to suppress the rebellion. Key centers of resistance, such as Delhi and Lucknow, were besieged and retaken after prolonged and bloody campaigns. Urban centers, villages, and even rural areas became battlefields. The rebellion demonstrated both the organizational capability of Indian forces and the ruthless efficiency of British military power, leaving lasting scars on the social and political landscape. The suppression of the rebellion was marked by significant violence. Thousands of rebels, both sepoys and civilians, were executed or subjected to collective punishment. Cities were destroyed, lands were confiscated, and entire communities were punished for perceived complicity. While the British reasserted control, the rebellion exposed vulnerabilities in company administration, highlighting the risks inherent in relying on a hybrid military and exploitative economic policies. It became clear that company rule, which had lasted over 2 centuries, was no longer sustainable. In the aftermath of 1857, sweeping administrative changes were implemented. The British government moved decisively to end the East India Company's rule, transferring authority to the Crown. In 1858, the Government of India Act formalized this transition, establishing the British Raj. India was now governed directly by the British Crown, with a Viceroy of India acting as the representative of the monarch. The East India Company, once the primary engine of British power, was dissolved, and its assets, administrative structures, and armies were absorbed into the new imperial framework. The British Raj introduced a more centralized and formalized system of governance. Provinces were reorganized, civil services were professionalized, and law and order were enforced through a more structured bureaucracy. The Indian Civil Service, ICS, became the backbone of administration, staffed primarily by British officials, though select Indians were later admitted through rigorous examinations. This new structure aimed to prevent the administrative weaknesses that had contributed to the 1857 rebellion and to ensure that British authority was both absolute and sustainable. Military reforms were equally significant. The British sought to reduce reliance on large numbers of potentially disloyal sepoys by restructuring the army. Recruitment policies emphasized regional and religious divisions to prevent unified uprisings. The number of European troops stationed in India was increased, and fortifications and cantonments were modernized. This dual strategy of selective recruitment and enhanced military presence was designed to prevent another widespread rebellion and to maintain imperial dominance. Economically, the British Raj sought to balance revenue extraction with infrastructure development. Railways, telegraphs, and canals were expanded, facilitating the movement of troops, goods, and information. These projects were often justified as modernizing initiatives, but they primarily served imperial interests by enabling tighter control and more efficient resource extraction. The British also reorganized land revenue systems, consolidating their authority over agriculture and trade while attempting to mitigate some of the abuses that had fueled discontent during company rule. Culturally and socially, the British adopted a more cautious approach. Missionary activity and social reforms continued, but were implemented with greater sensitivity to local traditions, recognizing that cultural imposition could provoke unrest. Education policies were expanded, focusing on creating a class of Indians conversant in English and British administrative norms. This emerging class served as intermediaries, bridging the gap between rulers and the governed, while subtly promoting loyalty to the crown. The consolidation of the British Raj after 1857 also involved strategic diplomacy with princely states. Unlike under the company, where annexation and displacement were frequent, the crown adopted a policy of indirect rule, preserving local monarchs in many regions under subsidiary treaties. These princes retained ceremonial authority and internal autonomy, while the British controlled foreign policy and overarching governance. This approach helped stabilize the empire, co-opting potential sources of resistance and projecting the image of continuity alongside change. By 1870, the foundations of modern British India were firmly established. The rebellion of 1857 had exposed vulnerabilities, but it had also provided the British with lessons in governance, military strategy, and political management. The empire that emerged was more centralized, bureaucratically organized, militarily secure, and economically integrated. While Indian society continued to experience disruption, exploitation, and cultural intervention, the British Raj had succeeded in consolidating power, laying the groundwork for nearly a century of imperial rule. The period from 1857 to 1870, therefore, represents both a crisis and a transformation. The revolt underscored the limits of company rule, revealing the dangers of over-reliance on hybrid armies, exploitative policies, and insufficient cultural understanding. Yet, the British response, marked by administrative overhaul, military reform, and strategic diplomacy, transformed this crisis into an opportunity. The British Raj emerged not only as a political authority, but also as a symbol of imperial resilience, capable of governing a complex and diverse subcontinent with unprecedented control. Consolidation, reform, and expansion under the British Raj, 1870 to 1900. Following the turbulent aftermath of the 1857 rebellion, the British Raj entered a period of consolidation and calculated expansion. The empire, now under the direct control of the crown, sought to stabilize its authority while exploiting India's vast economic and human resources. The last 3 decades of the 19th century were marked by administrative refinement, infrastructural development, economic integration, and the cautious introduction of social reforms, all designed to secure imperial dominance while minimizing the risk of renewed resistance. Administratively, the British Raj implemented a hierarchical and centralized structure to manage a subcontinent of immense diversity. The viceroy remained the supreme authority, assisted by a council of advisors, while provinces were overseen by governors who controlled civil, police, and revenue functions. The Indian Civil Service (ICS) became the backbone of governance, staffed predominantly by British officials trained in law, administration, and finance. Though Indians were slowly admitted to the service, entry remained difficult, reinforcing British control over key decision-making positions. This bureaucratic framework allowed the Raj to implement policies uniformly across India, reducing the potential for local resistance and ensuring the efficient extraction of resources. Economic exploitation intensified during this period, forming the foundation of Britain's wealth from India. Agriculture was increasingly oriented toward cash crops like cotton, indigo, tea, and opium, often at the expense of food crops. Land revenue systems, such as the Rayatwari and Mahalwari settlements, ensured steady income for the British Treasury. Profits were further augmented by tariffs, monopolies, and the strategic control of trade routes. India became a crucial supplier of raw materials to fuel Britain's Industrial Revolution, while simultaneously serving as a vast market for British manufactured goods. This dual role reinforced the economic dependency of India on Britain, integrating the subcontinent into the global capitalist system of the time. Infrastructure development became both a tool of control and an economic strategy. The expansion of railways, telegraphs, canals, and roads allowed for faster troop movements, improved communication, and the efficient transport of goods. Railways connected ports like Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras to the interior, linking agricultural and industrial centers to markets controlled by the British. Canals facilitated irrigation and agricultural expansion, but also enabled control over water resources, impacting local farming practices. While presented as modernizing initiatives, these infrastructural projects primarily served imperial interests, consolidating British dominance over both the economy and the landscape. Social and cultural reforms were implemented with caution, reflecting lessons learned from the 1857 rebellion. The British recognized that aggressive interference in religious and social practices could provoke unrest. Missionary activity continued, but the government avoided imposing Western norms on a large scale. Nevertheless, reforms were selectively introduced, often justified under the banner of civilizing missions. The abolition of practices like sati and the regulation of widow remarriage exemplified this approach, balancing humanitarian rhetoric with the pragmatic goal of strengthening imperial legitimacy. Education became a strategic instrument of imperial control. The British promoted English language schooling, creating a class of educated Indians familiar with Western thought, administration, and law. Figures like Thomas Macaulay, through the 1835 Minute on Indian Education, had earlier emphasized this approach, and its implementation expanded in the latter half of the century. Graduates of this system often served as clerks, teachers, and administrators, acting as intermediaries between the British rulers and the wider population. While education introduced new ideas, including modern science and liberal thought, it also reinforced social hierarchies and loyalty to the British state. The British also maintained a complex relationship with the princely states. Unlike earlier annexations under the East India Company, the Crown largely adopted indirect rule in these regions. Princely rulers retained internal authority and ceremonial status, but were subordinate to the British in matters of foreign policy, defense, and overarching governance. This arrangement provided political stability, co-opted potential rivals, and projected an image of continuity, while ensuring that ultimate power remained firmly in British hands. Military strategy continued to evolve. Lessons from 1857 influenced recruitment, deployment, and training policies. The Sepoy Army was reorganized, with particular attention to regional and caste divisions to prevent unified revolts. European troops were strategically stationed to act as a deterrent and rapid response force. Additionally, the British invested in fortifications, naval bases, and modern weaponry, ensuring technological superiority and the ability to suppress disturbances swiftly. Despite administrative efficiency and military strength, the period witnessed the emergence of early political consciousness among Indians. Economic exploitation, social reforms, and administrative centralization spurred debate among the educated elite. Newspapers, pamphlets, and public meetings became platforms for articulating grievances. By the late 19th century, Indian intellectuals and reformers began to question British policies, advocate for civil rights, and promote nationalist ideas. These developments, though limited in reach at the time, laid the foundation for the organized political movements of the 20th century. The British Raj also faced challenges from environmental and social factors. Famines, such as the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878, exposed the vulnerability of India's agrarian economy and the inadequacies of colonial governance. Policies that prioritized cash crops and export revenues exacerbated food shortages, resulting in widespread suffering and mortality. While the British implemented relief measures, they were often insufficient, highlighting the tension between economic exploitation and administrative responsibility. These crises contributed to a growing awareness among Indians of the costs of imperial rule and the inequalities inherent in the colonial system. By 1900, the British Empire in India had transformed into a highly centralized, bureaucratically efficient, and economically exploitative system. Its authority was reinforced by military power, administrative sophistication, and infrastructural control, while its legitimacy was bolstered by selective social reforms and indirect rule over princely states. The empire had become more than a colonial administration. It was a comprehensive system of governance designed to extract wealth, maintain order, and project British dominance over a vast and diverse population. The last decades of the 19th century also set the stage for the next phase of Indian history. Economic hardship, social discontent, and emerging political consciousness created a climate in which nationalist ideas could take root. Educated elites, influenced by Western thought and critical of imperial exploitation, began to organize, forming associations and debating strategies for political reform. This early nationalism was moderate at first, seeking representation within the imperial system, but it marked the beginning of a broader challenge to British authority. In conclusion, the period from 1870 to 1900 represents a phase of consolidation, integration, and cautious reform under the British Raj. The empire had stabilized its authority following the upheavals of 1857, expanded its territorial and economic reach, and implemented administrative and infrastructural innovations to secure control. At the same time, the seeds of resistance, political consciousness, and social critique were taking root, foreshadowing the transformative challenges that the British would face in the 20th century. The foundations laid during this period, centralized governance, economic exploitation, military control, and social engineering, would shape the trajectory of the British Empire in the East for decades to come. Nationalism, war, and the decline of the British Empire, 1900 to 1947. The dawn of the 20th century brought profound changes to British India. By 1900, the empire had reached the peak of its administrative efficiency and territorial control. Yet beneath the surface, political, social, and economic tensions were intensifying. The combination of exploitative policies, limited political representation, and growing exposure to Western ideas of democracy and nationalism created a fertile ground for organized resistance. This period would witness the rise of Indian nationalism, the participation of India in global conflicts, and the gradual erosion of British authority, culminating in independence in 1947. Indian nationalism, though nascent in the 19th century, gained momentum in the early 20th century. Educated Indians, many of whom had studied in Britain or in English-language institutions in India, began to challenge the legitimacy of British rule. The Indian National Congress, Inc., established in 1885, emerged as the principal platform for political engagement. Initially moderate in its demands, the Congress sought reforms within the framework of the British Empire, advocating for increased Indian representation in administration, greater autonomy in local governance, and fairer economic policies. Over time, however, political agitation became more assertive, reflecting the deepening frustration of Indians with imperial exploitation. Economic grievances played a crucial role in fueling nationalist sentiment. India, though a source of immense wealth for Britain, remained economically subordinate. Agriculture continued to prioritize cash crops for export, while traditional industries, such as textiles, were undermined by cheap British imports. Famines persisted, exacerbated by colonial policies that prioritized revenue and exports over local welfare. The economic disparity, combined with rising literacy and awareness, highlighted the inequities of British rule and strengthened the calls for self-determination. Global events further influenced the political climate in India. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, over 1 million Indian soldiers served in European, African, and Middle Eastern theaters, demonstrating loyalty to the empire, but also fostering political consciousness. The war placed enormous financial and human burdens on India, including high taxes, inflation, and requisitioning of resources. The post-war period witnessed widespread discontent, as promises of political concessions by Britain remained largely unfulfilled. This sense of betrayal catalyzed the emergence of mass movements led by leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi, who advocated for nonviolent resistance, and Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who promoted assertive nationalist campaigns. The interwar years saw the rise of mass political movements, civil disobedience campaigns, and increasingly organized protests. Gandhi's strategy of satyagraha, combining nonviolent resistance with moral appeal, mobilized millions of Indians across social, religious, and regional lines. Campaigns against unfair taxes, discriminatory laws, and imperial monopolies gained widespread support, signaling a shift from elite political advocacy to popular nationalist participation. The British, though militarily dominant, faced unprecedented challenges in controlling a politically awakened population. World events also reshaped the global perception of empire. World War II, 1939 to 1945, placed enormous demands on India, as resources, labor, and soldiers were mobilized to support Britain's war efforts. The war effort highlighted both India's strategic importance and the limits of British authority. Indian leaders increasingly pressed for immediate independence, pointing to the contradiction of fighting for democratic ideals abroad while denying them at home. Movements such as the Quit India movement of 1942 demonstrated the scale and intensity of nationalist agitation, challenging British control and forcing the empire to confront the inevitability of decolonization. Economic and infrastructural developments, initially designed to consolidate British authority, also facilitated resistance. Railways, telegraphs, and modern communication networks allowed nationalist leaders to coordinate campaigns, disseminate information, and mobilize mass support. Education, which had been promoted to create administrative intermediaries, now produced a politically conscious intelligentsia capable of articulating the demand for self-rule. Universities, newspapers, and literary societies became arenas for debate, critique, and the formation of a shared national identity. The British response to growing political agitation combined reform with repression. Concessions, such as the Government of India Acts of 1919 and 1935, aimed to introduce limited self-governance and provincial autonomy while preserving ultimate imperial authority. These measures, however, fell short of nationalist expectations, fueling further protests. Simultaneously, the British relied on police, military, and legal mechanisms to suppress dissent, often resorting to harsh measures that deepened resentment. This dual strategy of partial reform and coercion revealed the inherent contradictions of late colonial rule. Social and religious dynamics added layers of complexity. India's diverse population, divided by language, caste, religion, and region, presented both challenges and opportunities for nationalist mobilization. The British often attempted to exploit these divisions through policies of divide and rule, fostering communal tensions to weaken unified opposition. However, leaders like Gandhi sought to bridge these divides, promoting inclusive nationalist narratives that emphasized unity and collective identity. Despite these efforts, communal tensions, particularly between Hindus and Muslims, increasingly influenced political strategies, foreshadowing future challenges for a united India. By the mid-1940s, the cumulative pressures of nationalist movements, economic strain, and global geopolitical changes made the continuation of British rule in India untenable. Britain, weakened by 2 world wars and facing mounting domestic and international criticism, recognized that Indian independence was inevitable. Negotiations, political compromises, and the persistent struggle of Indian leaders culminated in the decision to transfer power. On August 15, 1947, India emerged as a sovereign nation, marking the end of nearly 350 years of British engagement in the East and the dissolution of the empire in the subcontinent. The period from 1900 to 1947 thus represents the twilight of British rule in India. Nationalism, mass movements, economic exploitation, global conflicts, and administrative reforms all interacted to challenge imperial authority. While the British retained military and bureaucratic dominance for decades, the rising political consciousness, mobilization of the population, and participation in global events ultimately undermined the legitimacy and sustainability of colonial rule. The empire, which had evolved from a trading company to a centralized imperial state, finally succumbed to the forces of self-determination, marking the end of a historic era in the East. This phase highlights the paradoxes of late colonialism. The British Raj achieved administrative sophistication, economic integration, and infrastructural modernization. Yet these very measures also empowered Indians to challenge imperial authority. The emergence of a politically conscious, organized, and assertive population ensured that the empire, once seemingly unassailable, faced its ultimate decline. By 1947, the British Empire in India had become a relic of a bygone era, leaving behind legacies of governance, infrastructure, economic patterns, and cultural encounters that would shape the newly independent nation for generations. Legacies of empire, politics, economy, and society, 1947 and beyond. The departure of the British in 1947 did not mark an abrupt end to their influence. Nearly 350 years of engagement, from trade posts to full imperial rule, left profound and lasting legacies on India's political structures, economic systems, social dynamics, and cultural landscape. The consequences of British governance continued to shape post-independence India and neighboring nations, underscoring how deeply the empire had woven itself into the fabric of the subcontinent. Politically, the British legacy was both structural and institutional. The administrative frameworks developed under the East India Company and later the British Raj provided the foundation for the modern Indian state. Civil services, provincial administrations, and judicial systems, though initially designed to consolidate imperial control, were adopted and adapted by independent India. The Indian civil service, though largely European during colonial times, evolved into the Indian Administrative Service, ensuring continuity in governance, policy implementation, and bureaucracy. Similarly, provincial governance models, codified laws, and standardized revenue systems enabled India to transition into a functioning sovereign state without total institutional collapse. The parliamentary system, legal codes, and constitutional frameworks in post-independence India were deeply influenced by British models. India's constitution, adopted in 1950, reflected the British emphasis on rule of law, separation of powers, and civil liberties, though it incorporated distinct democratic principles suitable to India's diverse society. Electoral systems, political parties, and legislative structures also drew from colonial administrative precedents, demonstrating how centuries of governance under the British had inadvertently prepared India for self-rule. Economically, the impact of British policies was more ambivalent. On one hand, infrastructural developments such as railways, ports, telegraphs, and canals created a platform for post-independence industrialization and trade. These networks enabled the movement of goods and people across the subcontinent, facilitating regional integration. On the other hand, colonial economic exploitation left deep scars. Agriculture had been reshaped to prioritize cash crops for export, undermining subsistence farming and contributing to recurring famines. Traditional industries, particularly textiles, had been systematically deindustrialized to favor British manufacturing, creating long-term structural weaknesses. Post-independence India faced the dual challenge of leveraging colonial infrastructure while redressing economic imbalances inherited from imperial policies. Socially, the British left a complex legacy. Policies of social reform and education created a class of English-educated Indians who would become leaders, administrators, and intellectuals in independent India. Missionary schools, universities, and technical institutions introduced modern sciences, literature, and critical thought, fostering a politically conscious elite capable of organizing nationalist movements. Yet, these same policies also contributed to social stratification, as education and administrative opportunities were limited, favoring certain castes, regions, and communities over others. The lingering effects of this uneven access influenced post-independence debates on social justice, affirmative action, and equitable development. Culturally, British influence was equally multifaceted. English language, literature, legal norms, and architectural styles became embedded within Indian society, particularly in urban centers. Cities like Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, and Delhi bear enduring marks of British urban planning, from government buildings to rail terminals and civic institutions. Simultaneously, colonial exposure facilitated the cross-fertilization of ideas, blending Western thought with indigenous traditions, producing movements in literature, law, education, and the arts that were distinctly modern yet rooted in Indian identity. The legacy of divide and rule policies, however, proved more contentious. British strategies often exacerbated religious, linguistic, and regional divisions, creating tensions that persisted long after independence. The partition of India and Pakistan in 1947 was directly influenced by colonial administrative and political decisions, including the manipulation of communal identities to maintain control. The resulting displacement, violence, and loss of life underscore the enduring human costs of imperial policies that prioritized governance over societal cohesion. The empire's impact on India's military and defense structures was also significant. The sepoy system, once a tool of British control, had trained generations of Indians in military discipline, organization, and modern weaponry. Post-independence, India and Pakistan inherited these forces, forming the basis of their national armies. British military traditions, training programs, and organizational hierarchies continued to influence South Asian defense strategies well into the 20th century. Economically and politically, the global integration initiated by the British continued to shape India's position in the world. Colonial trade networks, resource extraction policies, and global market orientation had made India a crucial component of British imperial commerce. After independence, India leveraged these networks while striving to assert economic sovereignty. Industrial policies, import substitution strategies, and later liberalization reforms were all conducted within a framework that, in many ways, had been defined by the empire. The British Empire's impact on law and justice was equally enduring. Codified legal systems, judicial hierarchies, and contract laws introduced under colonial rule provided a stable framework for post-independence governance. While some laws were designed to protect imperial interests, their underlying principles of uniformity, evidence, and procedural justice were adopted and adapted by independent India. The judiciary became a cornerstone of Indian democracy, balancing the legacy of British legal rationality with indigenous social and ethical values. By the mid-20th century, India had transformed a century of colonial legacies into the foundations of a sovereign state. Infrastructure, administration, education, and political institutions, though originally intended to serve imperial interests, were repurposed to build a modern nation. At the same time, the social, economic, and cultural inequalities inherited from British rule demanded reform, highlighting the duality of imperial legacies. They were both tools for nation-building and sources of enduring challenges. In retrospect, the British Empire in the East created a paradoxical legacy. Its rule was marked by exploitation, inequality, and social disruption. Yet it also introduced systems, institutions, and technologies that enabled the emergence of modern states. India, Pakistan, and other former territories inherited both the benefits and the burdens of imperial governance, shaping their post-colonial trajectories. While political sovereignty was achieved, the structural, economic, and cultural imprints of the empire remained, influencing governance, society, and identity long after the Union Jack was lowered for the last time. The period after 1947 illustrates how deeply the British had embedded themselves into the subcontinent's political and social fabric. Independence represented not just a political victory, but also the beginning of a long process of negotiating, reforming, and adapting the inherited structures of governance, law, and economy. The empire's legacies, both constructive and destructive, continued to shape debates about development, justice, identity, and sovereignty, ensuring that the history of British engagement in the East remained a living, influential force in the modern era. Reflections and Legacy: The British Empire in the East. The story of the British Empire in the East is a tale of ambition, conquest, governance, and transformation. From its early days as a trading enterprise to the establishment of the British Raj, the empire left an indelible mark on India, Southeast Asia, and the broader region. Its legacy is complex, marked by economic exploitation, political control, and social disruption, yet also by infrastructural development, administrative organization, and cultural exchange. Understanding this duality is essential to grasping how the empire shaped the modern East. One of the most striking features of the British Empire was its ability to adapt its strategies to local conditions. In India, this meant balancing direct rule with indirect control, combining military might with diplomacy, and integrating colonial administration with existing societal structures. The British mastered the art of governance through compromise, coercion, and strategic reform, allowing them to maintain authority over diverse and vast territories for centuries. Their approach was systematic, often ruthless, yet highly effective in consolidating power over regions that had previously been politically fragmented. Economically, the British transformed the East into a global economic hub serving imperial interests. India, for example, became a key supplier of raw materials like cotton, tea, and opium, while simultaneously serving as a market for British manufactured goods. Infrastructure such as railways, ports, telegraphs, and roads facilitated not only trade and resource extraction, but also administrative control. Although these developments were primarily designed to benefit Britain, they inadvertently laid the groundwork for modern industrialization, transportation, and communication systems in post-independence nations. This paradoxical effect illustrates the enduring complexity of the empire's economic legacy. Socially and culturally, the British impact was equally profound. Policies aimed at education, legal reform, and social change reshaped the fabric of Indian society. English language education, Western legal principles, and institutionalized bureaucracy created a new, educated class capable of self-governance, political organization, and intellectual leadership. Missionary activity and social reform initiatives challenged traditional practices, sometimes fostering resentment, but also encouraging critical reflection and modernization. These efforts contributed to the emergence of a politically and socially conscious population, which would eventually demand independence and participate in shaping modern nation-states. Yet, the empire's strategies of divide and rule left enduring challenges. By exploiting religious, ethnic, and regional differences, the British maintained control, but also sowed seeds of conflict. The partition of India in 1947, resulting in the creation of Pakistan, is a stark example of how colonial policies influenced post-independence geopolitics and communal tensions. The legacy of division, combined with the economic and social inequalities established during colonial rule, created challenges for newly independent nations, shaping their political discourse and development priorities for decades. The British Empire also played a pivotal role in the global dynamics of power. Its control of the East allowed Britain to exert influence in international trade, diplomacy, and military affairs. Ports like Singapore, Bombay, and Calcutta became strategic nodes in a global network that linked Asia to Europe and Africa. This integration into global systems not only facilitated the flow of goods, ideas, and people, but also exposed colonies to global conflicts and economic fluctuations. The East became both a beneficiary of modern technology and infrastructure, and a stage for imperial exploitation, reflecting the dual nature of colonial engagement. Military organization and strategy under the British Empire had long-lasting effects. The sepoy armies, European officers, and modernized defense systems created during colonial rule laid the foundation for post-independence military structures. Countries like India and Pakistan inherited disciplined armies, modern training, and strategic doctrines, which became crucial for national defense and regional stability. The empire's focus on military efficiency, fortification, and technological superiority ensured that its influence extended beyond administrative and economic control, embedding itself in the security frameworks of successor states. As the 20th century progressed, the decline of the British Empire in the East became inevitable. Nationalist movements, socio-economic pressures, and global geopolitical shifts exposed the vulnerabilities of imperial rule. World wars highlighted Britain's dependence on colonial resources and manpower, while simultaneously weakening its capacity to maintain distant dominions. Indian independence in 1947 marked the symbolic and practical end of imperial authority, but the legacies of the British era persisted, shaping governance, economics, social structures, and international relations across the region. Reflecting on the British Empire in the East, one must recognize its dual character. On one hand, it was a system of control, exploitation, and cultural imposition, often achieved through violence and coercion. On the other hand, it introduced structures, technologies, and ideas that facilitated modernization, education, and political organization. The empire transformed local economies, societies, and governance in ways that were both beneficial and detrimental. Understanding this duality is key to comprehending the complexities of colonial history and its enduring impact on contemporary nations. The British Empire's story in the East is also a story of resilience, adaptation, and eventual resistance. Indigenous populations, subjected to foreign domination, navigated a landscape of oppression, negotiation, and reform. They absorbed new technologies and ideas, organized politically, and ultimately reclaimed sovereignty. The trajectory from conquest to independence illustrates the interplay between imperial ambition and local agency, highlighting how colonial rule shaped and was shaped by the people it governed. For modern audiences, the British Empire in the East offers lessons in governance, economics, social policy, and international relations. It demonstrates the capacities and limits of imperial power, the consequences of economic exploitation, and the complexities of cultural interaction. It also underscores the importance of agency, resilience, and organized resistance in shaping historical outcomes. The legacies of this period continue to influence politics, society, and economics in former colonies, reminding us that history is not merely a record of the past, but an active force in the present. In conclusion, the British Empire in the East was a force of profound transformation. Its reach extended across centuries, regions, and societies, leaving behind structures, systems, and memories that continue to resonate. While it was characterized by exploitation and domination, it also fostered modernization, connectivity, and intellectual engagement. Understanding its history is essential to appreciating the complexities of contemporary South Asia and the broader Eastern world. The story of the British Empire in the East is not merely one of power and conquest. It is a story of interaction, adaptation, and enduring influence. The British Empire in the East shaped history in ways both visible and subtle, leaving a legacy that still influences the political, economic, and cultural landscape of Asia today. From trade posts to sprawling colonial rule, from resistance to eventual independence, the Empire's story is a testament to the complexities of power, ambition, and human resilience. If you found this journey through history insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Comment below with your thoughts. What aspect of the British Empire in the East surprised you the most? And check out our other videos to explore the fascinating stories of history that continue to impact our lives today.